January 31st, 1945. Clark Air Base, Luzon, Philippines. The midday sun burned across the tarmac, the heat shimmering like a mirage. The temperature hovered near 35 degrees Celsius, and the air smelled of oil, dust, and long-forgotten battles. Major Frank T. McCoy, U.S. Army Air Forces, wiped the sweat from his forehead as he approached the aircraft that would challenge everything he believed about Japanese engineering, and perhaps about war itself. He'd spent years studying the wreckage of enemy aircraft scattered across the Pacific, the jungles of New Guinea, the coral atolls of the Solomons, the humid fields of Biak. McCoy had crawled through twisted fuselages, dissected burned-out engines, and cataloged every inch of shattered aluminum. But never had he seen what stood before him that day. Tail number 76312, a Mitsubishi G4M bomber, sat before him almost pristine. No bullet holes, no burn marks, no crash damage. Somehow, amid retreat and chaos, the Japanese had left behind a complete operational bomber. Its cigar-shaped fuselage stretched almost 20 meters long. The wings, 25 meters from tip to tip, cast a sharp shadow across the cracked runway. McCoy climbed the wing, his boots thudding softly against the metal. He found the inspection panel latches and flipped one open. No locks, no extra security. And what he saw inside made him stop cold. The fuel tanks, massive, gleaming, and unprotected. No armor plating, no self-sealing layers, no insulation. Just a thin 2-millimeter sheet of aluminum separating thousands of liters of high-octane aviation fuel from the outside world. McCoy checked another panel, then another. Every single tank was the same. Bare. Vulnerable. This wasn't the result of damage or desperation. This was design, intentional, purposeful. And suddenly, the nickname American pilots had given these bombers, Flying Cigar, One-Shot Lighter, Flying Zippo, made sense. This was the machine that had carried Japan's war effort across thousands of miles of ocean, and the same one that had cost them more lives than perhaps any other aircraft they ever built. What McCoy didn't yet realize was that this aircraft told a deeper story, one that began almost a decade earlier, in Tokyo, in 1937. The Imperial Japanese Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics had issued a set of specifications that bordered on the impossible. They wanted a land-based bomber capable of carrying 800 kilograms of bombs across a combat radius of 2,400 kilometers, roughly 1,500 miles. It had to reach speeds of 400 kilometers per hour, and it had to be operated by a crew of 7. At the time, no bomber in the world could meet those demands. American designs like the B-17 Flying Fortress emphasized armor and heavy defensive guns. British bombers prioritized payload capacity. But the Japanese Navy had a different vision. They wanted reach, the ability to strike anywhere in the Pacific, from island bases that had no runways large enough for massive, heavily armored planes. The contract went to Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. The lead designer, Kiro Honjo, faced an engineering nightmare. The bomber's range requirement meant it would need to carry almost its own empty weight in fuel, nearly 4,800 liters, or 3,400 kilograms of gasoline. Weight was the enemy. Every kilogram counted. Honjo's team began cutting. Armor plating? Gone. Reinforced fuel tanks? Gone. Even protective rubber layers, standard in Western bombers, were removed. You see, Western designers had already developed something called self-sealing fuel tanks. They used layers of rubber that swelled upon contact with gasoline, sealing bullet holes automatically and preventing leaks and fires. The system wasn't perfect, but it saved lives. The trade-off? It added around 500 kilograms of weight. That weight in Honjo's design would mean 800 liters less fuel, nearly 1,000 kilometers less range. And so, in what would become one of the most consequential design decisions of the Pacific War, Honjo eliminated protection entirely. Every gram saved went into extending range. The bomber would fly farther than anything the world had ever seen, but its crew would do so inside what was essentially a flying gas tank. The first prototype took flight in October 1939. The results were breathtaking. Over 6,000 kilometers in range unloaded, far beyond the Navy's requirement. Speed exceeded 420 kilometers per hour. The Navy was thrilled. Orders followed immediately, and by early 1941, the G4M, codenamed Betty by Allied intelligence, was in full production. When the first units received the bomber, the crews were amazed by its performance and quietly terrified by its fragility. But nobody dared question Navy orders. On December 8, 1941, just hours after Pearl Harbor, 82 G4M and 26 G3M bombers took off from Formosa, bound for Clark Field in the Philippines. The strike was devastating. At 12:35 p.m., they descended from 20,000 feet and dropped over 600 bombs. 17 American B-17s sat parked on the ground. 12 were obliterated instantly. Nearly every P-40 fighter was destroyed. In 45 minutes, American air power in the Philippines ceased to exist. The Bettys returned home without a scratch, having flown farther than any American bomber could reach. 2 days later, their legend grew. December 10, 1941. British Force Z, consisting of HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, steamed off the coast of Malaya. The British believed their ships, fast and modern, were nearly invincible. They had no air cover. 26 G4M bombers approached from high altitude. In 2 coordinated torpedo runs, they struck both ships repeatedly. In less than 2 hours, both capital ships sank. It was the first time in naval history that modern battleships, actively defending themselves, had been sunk solely by aircraft. Winston Churchill would later write, "In all the war, I never received a more direct shock." The Betty's range had made it possible. Through early 1942, the G4M dominated the skies. Betty bombers struck as far as Darwin, Australia, 1,500 miles from their bases in Timor. From Rabaul, they bombed Port Moresby almost daily, flying over 600 miles of mountains and jungle. The Allies couldn't hit back. Their fighters simply didn't have the range. The tactical imbalance was total. But that imbalance had a fragile foundation. Because the moment Allied fighters appeared in numbers, the moment they could intercept the Betty, everything changed. August 8, 1942, 23 G4M bombers took off from Rabaul for Guadalcanal, a mission they had flown many times before. But this time, the Americans knew they were coming. F-4F Wildcats from Henderson Field rose to meet them. Marine Captain Marion Carl led the attack. He recalled, "We came at them from above and ahead. The moment our rounds hit their wings, they just exploded. I'd never seen anything like it. Within minutes, 18 of the 23 Betty bombers were gone, fireballs falling into the sea. Over 120 Japanese airmen died that day. The survivors reported that a single .50 caliber bullet striking the wing could ignite the entire aircraft. The Betty earned its nicknames that afternoon. Flying Zippo, one shot lighter. American pilots learned to aim for the wings. They didn't even need to target the engines. By late 1942, Betty bombers were dying faster than Japan could replace them. In just 3 months over Guadalcanal, more than 100 were destroyed. 700 airmen gone, burned alive or drowned. Technical Sergeant Robert Hayes, part of the U.S. technical team that examined captured wreckage in New Guinea, wrote in his report, "There's nothing there, just fuel tanks and aluminum. No protection at all. It's suicide in the sky." Japanese airmen knew it too. Letters recovered after the war tell a tragic story. Lieutenant Fujio Yu of the Takao Air Group wrote to his family in October 1942, "We call our aircraft the Hamaki, the cigar. Every mission we joke about who will light up today. But it isn't a joke. Yesterday Tanaka's plane took a single hit. We watched it burn all the way down. 7 men. I knew them all." Petty Officer Hiroshi Kawasaki wrote in his diary, "We're not flying bombers anymore. We're flying coffins that happen to have wings." In desperation, some crews tried crude fixes, lining the wings with rubber mats or hanging flak vests over the fuel tanks. It changed nothing. Commander Takahashi Kaiichi filed a report in late 1942. "The G4M is operationally obsolete. Every mission ends in death. We need protection, or we will have no crews left." His report was ignored. Japan's industry was already stretched to breaking. They couldn't redesign the bomber or slow production. The pilots simply kept flying and dying. By mid-1943, survival rates for Betty crews on the Rabaul-Guadalcanal route fell below 30% for those completing 30 missions. Most didn't live long enough to finish a tour. Warrant Officer Masao Saito, one of the few to survive the entire campaign, later said, "We knew. We all knew. We were dying because someone decided our lives were worth less than a few hundred kilograms of weight." Then came the most infamous moment of all. April 18th, 1943. Over the jungles of Bougainville, Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was flying aboard a G4M. American cryptographers had broken Japanese codes. They knew his route, his schedule, even the minute he would be in the air. 18 P-38 Lightning fighters took off from Guadalcanal to intercept him. First Lieutenant Rex Barber closed in behind Yamamoto's aircraft and opened fire. "I aimed for the wing route," he later said. One burst and the whole plane caught fire. Instantly, there was no chance. Yamamoto's G4M plunged into the jungle, burning all the way down. There were no survivors. Even Japan's most revered military leader was helpless against his own Air Force's design flaw. 2 years later, the tragedy repeated itself in a final, desperate act. March 21, 1945, 18 Betty bombers set out from Kyushu, each carrying an Ohka rocket-powered suicide bomb slung beneath its fuselage. The added weight and drag crippled their speed. American radar detected them 60 miles out. Hellcats pounced. Within minutes, all 18 Bettys were gone. None made it close enough to launch their weapons. 137 bomber crewmen and 15 Ohka pilots died in the flames. A Betty couldn't even deliver its suicide bomb before becoming one itself. When Major McCoy finished his inspection at Clark Field, his report was meticulous and damning. Eliminating self-sealing fuel tanks had saved 500 kilograms, extending range by almost 1,000 kilometers. But it came at an unimaginable cost. A B-17 weighed over 16,000 kilograms empty, more than double the Betty's 6,700. The difference was armor, protection, survivability. American bomber crews faced loss rates of about 3% per mission in the Pacific. Betty crews? more than 15%, 5 times higher. By 1943, Japan's trained airmen were dying faster than replacements could be trained. New pilots were sent to combat after only 6 months of rushed instruction. They climbed into aircraft that could barely take a hit and burned on their first missions. It was a death spiral, one Japan's Air Force could never escape. August 19th, 1945. 2 white-painted Betty bombers, each marked with green crosses, lifted off from Japan. They carried not bombs, but delegates, Japan's surrender delegation, en route to accept Allied terms aboard the USS Missouri. The war had come full circle. The same bomber that opened the Pacific War at Clark Field now carried the message of its end. Of the 2,400 Bettys built, roughly half were destroyed in combat. Over 10,000 airmen died flying them. A Betty crewman's odds of surviving 30 missions were less than 30%. Major McCoy's final report concluded with a single, haunting line. Japan built an aircraft that did exactly what it was designed to do: fly far, strike deep, and die quickly. The Betty's unprotected fuel tanks weren't a mistake. They were the physical manifestation of Japan's wartime philosophy. That victory was worth any price, even the lives of those who carried it. In contrast, American bombers were built with protection, redundancy, and survivability in mind. Crews came home, learned, trained others, and grew stronger. Japan's Air Force burned itself to ash in the skies over the Pacific. Each G4M that fell into the sea was not just a machine destroyed. It was 7 lives extinguished in seconds. 7 men sacrificed for range. And that's what Major McCoy saw that hot day in 1945, staring at the hollow metal. Shells inside tail number 76312. He wasn't just looking at an airplane. He was looking at a nation's fatal calculation. A bomber that could fly farther than any in the world, but could never bring its men home. A design that traded safety for reach, hope for fuel, humanity for numbers. In the end, the Betty did exactly what it was built to do. It reached distant targets. It carried Japan's might across the Pacific. And it burned again and again until there was nothing left to give. Because when you build a weapon that values range over life, you may conquer distance, but you lose everything else. History is more than battles and machines. It's the choices behind them. The Mitsubishi G4M Betty wasn't just an aircraft. It was a lesson in how ambition can outweigh humanity. A symbol of brilliance and tragedy, because in war, every design, every command, and every sacrifice tells us what a nation valued most, and sometimes what it lost forever. If this story moved you, don't stop here. Subscribe now and join us as we uncover more untold stories of World War II, the decisions, the courage, and the human cost behind the headlines. Subscribe for more cinematic World War II documentaries. Watch next, The Final Flight of Yamamoto, the assassination that changed the Pacific War. Stay with us. History isn't over. It's waiting to be remembered.